Welcome to the AIC podcast, where we share practical guidance and insight for members and help the industry understand how the agri-food supply chain works. I'm Wendy Ford, I'm the AIC Communications Manager, and today I'm joined by Ed Barker, AIC Head of Policy and External Affairs, and James McCulloch, AIC Head of Feed. We recently covered EUDR on the podcast before, but there have been a number of developments recently. James, can you start by explaining what's changed since we last spoke?
Commission produced their simplification package in May, June time. And I guess the immediate thing to say is there were not that many direct implications of that certainly for the UK feed sector. There were some amendments made to the annex of relevant products, mainly around palm derivatives, but nothing specific that we use in feed. And there were some amendments to the responsibilities of downstream operators, sort of simplifying their requirements to comply with the regulation. And then some quite useful ideas around demonstrating what legislation you would have to comply with in terms of country of origin legislation to demonstrate that the commodities have been legally produced. So I think that was about it, Ed, wasn't it?
Yeah, I don't think we're expecting anything different, really. Obviously, we've been talking to a number of people in Europe from FEFAC, and politically, it looks like it's very much coming in on the 1st of January. It's the question we get asked the most: is it still going ahead? And all the signs suggest that really is going forwards now. I mean, where are we? Mid-July. Obviously, it has been delayed twice already, but to do it for a third time, I think would be a big political climb down to admit that it's not ready for a third year in a row. But that pressure will come. There's no doubt about it. But I think we do have to be realistic about the fact that this is more likely than previous iterations, which is why it's so relevant now for us for Northern Ireland as well.
So one thing we've talked about before is whether the scope of the regulation could evolve over time. James, you mentioned compound feed isn't currently included. Should businesses see that as settled, or is there a chance the scope could widen in the future?
Yeah, I think the only sort of feed-related comment I'd make, just to sort of help to understand maybe where the Commission might go in the future as far as the annex is concerned, is that they had considered including compound feed within the annex and chose not to. I mean, the sort of methodology they used to determine whether to include things or not, frankly, was pretty spurious, but nonetheless, they have not included compound feed in the annex. But in the working document, it says for the time being. So it suggests that they may well look. I think there's a revision clause for the annex or for the whole regulation in a sort of a 2 years down the line, in which case I'm guessing we might expect to see some further amendment to the annex when the regulation is reviewed and the revision clause is taken advantage of, really.
Let's look closer to home. What do members in Northern Ireland need to know following the government's announcement?
So, yeah, the UK government made an announcement in June on their approach to deforestation across the UK. So there's two elements to that. I mean, the first thing, I guess, is that they've confirmed that EUDR will be implemented in Northern Ireland, and clearly we're anticipating that implementation date will be the 1st of January 2027. And they indicated that the competent authority for certainly the feed components or commodities in scope would be the Department for Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs. So that was a useful clarification as to their intentions as far as EUDR in Northern Ireland is concerned.
Yeah, I suppose that looking ahead now is this is going to come under the microscope a lot more in terms of the supply chain. We're going to have inevitably lots of questions from not just members, but also the whole sector, businesses. We forget that EUDR is more than just soy and palm. Obviously, we're PKE because we focus on it from a feed perspective, but it's timber, it's cocoa, it's coffee, it's a lot of products in scope. And so all of those businesses relevant in the supply chain are going to have to start thinking about this. And I'm a bit worried that authorities in both the UK and Northern Ireland aren't prepared for the volume of questions and correspondence they're going to get coming their way, because supply chains are very technical. The requirements are very exacting. And so I think on us and the industry, it's going to be really important that we start thinking through all those potential questions, and that inevitably when those questions come, that there's a way in which the authorities can be nimble and provide answers pretty quickly. But we really haven't left ourselves a lot of time to be able to resolve that, really.
Yeah, I think that highlights just how many moving parts there are in this process. James, can you give us a couple of real-world examples of where businesses are already identifying practical complications?
Yeah, I think that late announcement and therefore the imminent implementation in under 6 months' time is probably the major concern for members in Northern Ireland in terms of preparation, access to the IT system, obviously engagement with the competent authorities. I mean, certain issues which are sort of idiosyncratic to Northern Ireland trade. For instance, it's quite common for vessels to arrive off the coast of Ireland and partially discharge in Dublin and then carry on up to Belfast or Carlingford or wherever it might be, and then discharge the rest of the cargo. So EUDR compliance of that cargo clearly will be managed by two different competent authorities, one in the south, one in the north, which creates a complication. The other one, which is interesting, is that mixed consignments of products, so for instance, soybean meal and soy hulls might be loaded onto the same vessel, and soybean meal is within the scope of EUDR, whereas the soy hulls are not. So again, that adds another sort of complexity to how to manage. EUDR is applied at the point of import. So, the challenge there is if there are any concerns or requirements or question marks around soybean meal, then does that hold up the supply of hulls as well? So there's quite a number of things that certainly our members and NIGTA have already laid at the door of their competent authority to say we need answers to these things pretty quickly.
Yeah, we shouldn't forget as well that, as far as we're aware, Northern Ireland is the only place that has a mandate to implement EU deforestation regulations that isn't an EU member state. And as a result of that, it's in a very unique position with regards to having that guidance in place, because it's going to be reliant on the Commission for a lot of areas in terms of implementing and effectively translating all those requirements into a domestic legislative proposal. And we shouldn't forget that, not least because of the way in which it will inevitably influence whatever comes in for the rest of the UK in future.
Alongside Northern Ireland implementation, the UK government has also set out its intentions for a future Great Britain deforestation regime. What's the relationship between EUDR in Northern Ireland and the proposed GB Forest Risk Commodities Regulation, also known as GBFRC, which is another acronym to add to the world of acronyms?
Yeah, GBFRC, which is, I think, what they're going to call it. So, GB Forest Risk Commodity Regulations. I mean, the announcement that was made around EUDR in Northern Ireland was made at the same time as intentions for bringing forward a deforestation regulation in GB, which we know was first sort of mooted and remains pegged within the Environment Act of 2021. And I think our view is that the necessity to make an announcement on EUDR basically brought into sharp focus the fact that an announcement on GB would have to be considering how best to minimise the divergence of a GBFRC and EUDR applicable in Northern Ireland, but without having to reopen the Environment Act. I mean, that's, I think, how we're reading it, isn't it, Ed?
Yes, effectively, because we have to break down a few things. The Environment Act in the UK outlines provisions for bringing in a UK policy on deforestation, or what they call forest risk commodities. And it is quite specific in some of the things it can and cannot do. Since the Environment Act was published, we had EUDR that was brought in Europe, and that is different in how it applies. So the challenge for DEFRA and policymakers will be how to implement something that's still within the scope framework of the Environment Act. And that's not an easy thing to do, because it doesn't make allowances, for example. It talks about legality. It doesn't talk about deforestation at all in the Environment Act. It's also very clear that it's a due diligence process on business. In other words, business is undertaking a due diligence type assessment. There's nothing in it about at point of import controls, checks. And I think that's going to be a fundamental difference that we'll see in the difference between the two. So it's going to be interesting, if I can call it that, as to how DEFRA are going to connect, if you like, EUDR with the UK legislation. It's almost like two gauge systems that aren't quite the same. And I think there's a role probably for us as ARC to help think, practically about how we can see that brought in. But we're pretty sure, looking at things, we can't have an imports control system. The other consideration behind all of this, of course, is resource. We've heard from our partner equivalent organisations in Germany and France that quite a considerable amount of money has had to have been found in order to develop an authorisation, a competent authority, an IT system to enable the EUDR to happen. So that is a consideration as to actually how much appetite there is within DEFRA and within Cabinet to spend on this.
Yeah, I think, certainly the feedback we've had to date from DEFRA and a sort of a public webinar that they held on it and a sort of Q&A session is confirming what you just said, Ed. I think they're not anticipating any import control. It's basically relying on a due diligence report submitted by businesses, sort of in arrears. In other words, a year down the line. They are anticipating that due diligence report for first places on the market. So in other words, those that are bringing those commodities into GB for the first time will require evidence which is similar to or the same as evidence that might be required under EUDR. So in other words, geolocation data, evidence of legality, etc., etc. What's not entirely clear at the moment is what the requirement will be for so-called downstream operators, because that's one of the major simplifications in EUDR, and that the requirements for downstream operators, i.e. compound feed manufacturers, farmers and others, are much reduced in that you may not have to submit due diligence statements, but may have to hold evidence of compliance from your supplier. So in other words, if you're a feed compounder and you're buying your soya or your palm from an importer, then there will be a requirement for you to hold information from that supplier that the material is compliant. But the question as to what you may have to submit or whether you have to register as an operator, that remains, I guess, unclear. And I think will certainly be part of the consultation process that DEFRA anticipate later on in the sort of summer/autumn on the GBFRC proposals.
Let's talk embedded commodities. If the scope for GBFRC is effectively going to be the same as EUDR, does that mean embedded commodities are in or not? And what does this mean for imports of products that are fed on soya?
So the proposal to sort of more closely align GBFRC with EUDR extends to the scope of commodities. So in other words, we know that EUDR is operating with a positive list in the annex of relevant commodities and products derived from those commodities. So it looks likely that the UK government is going to do the same thing, which raises the question around the inclusion of embedded commodities in imported foods, so pork, poultry, eggs, etc., because they are not included within the scope of EUDR. So the question remains, and again, I'm anticipating some opportunity to respond to this as far as consultation is concerned, is how imports of prawns or poultry from Thailand might be managed, given that under the regulations they would not need to have been fed feed that would be effectively demonstrably deforestation free. I think that's the question, and B, then the implications for competitiveness of UK livestock farmers, really.
It's a question that we get a lot from sort of farmers, consumer groups and NGOs and others, is about what does this mean, not just for the direct import of the commodity, but like you say, the imports of pork, poultry, dairy, any sort of other products that are themselves consuming these products and don't have to comply with any deforestation requirements. And that, had we been sort of going ahead under what we'd been expecting under the UK proposals, this was actively something government really did look at. It was something they wanted to look at through the whole supply chain to report on. So that would have been taken account of. But now that we look to be adopting more of an EUDR approach, this now in the UK could well completely fall off the radar completely. And I think that is a risk. I think particularly when we're looking at competitiveness, particularly in livestock, from a number of different areas, this is one of them. And farming representative groups, I am sure, will be saying, or will be pointing this out and saying it's a real potential competitiveness loss, and ultimately could be one of those things that we just outsource production to other countries that don't have this requirement in place. And we've seen it before, and it would be a pretty big mistake if it was allowed to happen again.
Yeah, and I think it is fair to say it's general expectation that if commodities are needing to comply with deforestation regulation, then it is expected that they will be traded at a premium. So that again is the point.
We've definitely covered a lot of ground today, and there are certainly a lot of unanswered questions. But listeners will naturally want to know what happens next. What are AIC's immediate priorities over the coming months?
I think our immediate priority is to, which we've already done, is to request a face-to-face meeting with DEFRA to better understand their announcements and the detail of what they've announced. Clearly, their announcement has perhaps created more questions than answers, and also to understand their intentions as far as consultation, A, in terms of timing, and B, the scope of the consultation, because that's going to be very, very important. I think from Northern Ireland member standpoint, engaging with them, with NICTA and with DARE is vital, and probably we need to be also having discussions with DAFM in Southern Ireland, because as we've just indicated, there's a whole island trade of these commodities existing, and so some coordination between those competent authorities is going to be required. And then more close to home, in terms of members, clearly there'll be briefings. There'll be, I guess we'll do more webinars once more detail becomes known. And clearly, as members do, they can pick up the phone and ask us questions. We'll do our best to answer them.
I think we'll leave it there for today. There's still a lot we don't know, but hopefully this has helped explain what is changing, what isn't, and what members should be watching out for over the months ahead. So thank you, James and Ed, for your time today and for sharing your expertise. Members can find further updates, guidance, and resources on the AIC website and through our member communications. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back with another episode soon. If you found this useful, please share it with a colleague and check the show notes for links and definitions. And again, thank you for joining us. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily reflect any organisation they represent. This content is for informational purposes only and should not be considered professional advice. Listener discretion is advised. Thank you.